This is the first lesson in this survey course on history that I'm making available for teachers and parents who plan to make use of the history resources available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'd like to start with a little bit about my background as a student and teacher in history that will help parents and teachers to understand what we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and where these ideas came from. First of all, when I was in college, I was a top student, and my major was classics and ancient history. So I spent a lot of time in Greek and Roman civilization, and then focused on ancient history, which is a period of history that not many people study today. I was motivated to learn about ancient history because my goal in my historical studies was to help me to be able to read and understand and teach the Bible. And I knew that in order to do that, I had to have a good understanding of the history of the world from, let's say, the creation of the world all the way through to the time of the apostles. So I focused on ancient history and got to study a lot of things that very few people get to study today with some really great professors at a great university. While I studied, I also studied classical languages. I got into archaeology a little bit and things like that. And that was really where my interests were when I was in college. And then when I started teaching, I always had to teach some history classes, but I was primarily a Latin and Greek language teacher. But I also taught literature and history and writing courses and things like that as well. One experience I had when I got into teaching changed the way I thought about history teaching and teaching in general. I took for granted a great deal of historical knowledge that I didn't realize how much my knowledge of history influenced my other studies and helped me in my other studies, because to be honest, I thought a lot of my classmates and other students thought the same things, but I realized that my focus on history gave me some abilities that other students didn't have. And then when I got into teaching, I realized that that was even more true of students at the high school level than it was of my fellow college students. So what happened was I was teaching a literature class, and we were going through the writings of Homer and Virgil and Dante and all these quote-unquote great books. But as we were going through, I realized that the students had a very difficult time engaging in the books because there was just so much content that they didn't understand and weren't familiar with. Simple things like geography, the names of countries and cities and seas and rivers, things like that. They had no idea where these places were or what was significant about them. Characters, they had no idea who different people were. They had no idea who the different nations were and why their identities were important in the stories that we were reading. And so one day I decided to stop and just give the kids a little quiz. And what I did was I asked them 10 or so questions about chronology in history. Things like this: who came first, King David or the prophet Isaiah? Who came first, Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar? Who came first, Cicero or Demosthenes? Who came first, the philosopher Socrates or Lucretius? And so I went through just a dozen or so questions about basic chronology. Who came first? And I found that the kids really had no clue. They didn't know simple things like who came first, David or the Apostle Paul. Simple chronological facts that I think we often take for granted and assume people know, but they really don't know them. And so I started to make the effort as a teacher in all my classes to introduce students to chronology, just for the development of an overall sense of learning that would help them in all of their classes. Now, the way that this helps students, if we teach students to know chronology, what we do is we take a set of chronological events, let's say 100 events from world history. And what I did was I tried to think of what the most important chronological events in world history are. Not the most important or the most influential historical events, but the most important chronological events. And I made a list, and then I would just have the kids memorize that list, and I'd quiz them on the events and the dates, and I'd provide a little bit of explanation of what the dates and events were about and things like that. But we just went through this chronology, and then what I found was that really solved much of the problem that the kids had with literature. And it works like this. Let's say we're studying Homer's Odyssey. Well, we're going to start reading, we're going to start meeting places, characters, peoples, events, all kinds of details in the story. And kids who don't know any chronology have no grid through which to interpret and understand those events. Whereas for students who understand chronology, we can immediately start asking questions and making deductions about the things that we're reading. For example, what's significant about Greece at the time of the Trojan War? Well, if we know chronology, we can immediately place it historically. We can say, well, the Trojan War took place around 1200 BC. Okay, great. So what else do we know about that period of time? What else do we know about 1200 BC? And we can immediately start making more conclusions. We could say, well, King David was in Israel about 1000 BC. So this is pretty close to the time of King David. And the time of the Exodus was around 1400 BC. So this is, the Trojan War was between the Exodus, when Moses was alive, and the children of Israel were coming out of slavery, and the time of King David. So the Trojan War was right in between those events. So when we're reading Old Testament history, we're reading that history between the times of Moses and the times of David. As we're reading through that history and learning about different nations and the cultures and events of those periods, we're learning about the time of the Trojan War. So now all of a sudden our biblical studies can begin to inform our reading of Greek literature. So that's just a simple way that basic chronological knowledge can immediately benefit students when they read any kind of literature. Now, that's just literature. Let's talk about other subjects. When we consider a subject like philosophy, I can say, well, the scientific method was developed in 1620 when Francis Bacon published the Novum Organum, which taught the scientific method. 1620. Oh, but wait a minute. That's right around the time of the Protestant Reformation, because I know that Thomas More was put to death in 1535, and that was right around the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation were happening at the same time. Hey, is it possible that they were both coming from the same source? Is there a deeper philosophical cause of these events happening around the same time? Those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of reflections are very easy when we have a chronology to work with and can compare events. Here are some other things. I could say, oh, well, the theory of evolution was proposed by Charles Darwin in around 1860. What else is going on around 1860? Well, that's around the time of the Civil War in America. That's 100 years after the American Revolution. That's about 50 years before the World Wars. Well, John Dewey was active as an American philosopher and educator around 1920. So Dewey was active in education after the theory of evolution was promoted. And you see how all of these chronological events can begin to help us to think through any situation that we find in any of our studies and immediately start to provide us with information to reflect on and think about, because we can always just start with chronology. Okay, so what I began doing as a history teacher was abandoning the history textbook and almost entirely focusing on chronology and geography, because I found that without a systematic knowledge of these two subjects, any time spent trying to get kids to study history was wasted, because they just didn't know enough about the simple facts of chronology and geography. It's like trying to ask a kid to study algebra when he's never memorized the basic facts of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. We have to establish those things first, because if we don't have them, the higher studies are just impossible. And that's what's happening to most kids today who are in high school history or social studies classes, literature, any studies like that. They just don't have the necessary knowledge of basic chronology and geography to engage in the studies that they're being asked to engage in. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we have high school history courses: American history, American government, world history, church history, European history, and so on. But most importantly, before these comes our world chronology course. And this course has been popular with students ever since the CLA started, just as it was popular with my high school students when I was teaching in the classroom. But the world chronology class is a simple course that leads students through a number of events which they memorize. And these are important chronological events. As I said, these are events where if you memorize this event or these events, you can easily reason out other events. They're important chronological events. And I really believe that once kids get this framework of world chronology in their minds, courses like history and literature, even philosophy and other subjects, become very easy for them to enter into with a sort of intelligent, critical spirit, which is important for the kids. So our world chronology class is a simple, memory-focused course that teaches a chronology of world history, from the creation of the world, which we date around 4000 BC, all the way through the discovery of America in the 15 and 1600s. So that world chronology class provides a great framework for future studies in world history, literature, and philosophy. As for geography, we live in an age where we have at our disposal the most incredible tools for the study of geography. If you go online, and I'm sure you've seen this because we already use it every day, but you know that GPS is now how people get around. You plug in an address, a destination address on your phone, stick your phone on the dashboard, and it will tell you step-by-step directions how to get there as you drive. So GPS is part of this just unfathomable advance in technology as it affects the study of the geography of the world. Now, if we were to take that technology and now think, how can this technology affect our study of world geography? It's just mind-blowing. And let me just take you back again to my experience as a teacher. What I would see is all the history books would have maps. Almost everything was map-based. The textbooks would have maps or just pictures of, areas of the world and things like that. But it was mostly maps, maps, maps. And what I said is, the maps are helpful. I mean, it's important to see locations and geographical features on a map, but the map doesn't help us to understand why Athens was important, or why Troy was important, or why the Egyptians were able to thrive as a civilization where they were in northern Africa. These maps, they show us place names and things like that, but they don't help us to see what effect geography had on human events in history. And so what I did as a history teacher was I collected ground level photographs of all of the places that we studied in world history. Not overhead, not satellite images, but ground level. So for example, if we were going to study the Persian War in Greek history, I wanted to know, what did Greece look like from the vantage point of an approaching ship sailing through the Aegean Sea, approaching Athens. I wanted to see what Athens looked like. And as soon as you look at a picture like that, you can see, wow, that was an amazing place where I could see why civilization would develop around that place. It's just the location, the weather, the appearance of that place from the sea. It's just majestic and beautiful. You can see why that was a famous city. Or you could see why Troy, located on the entrance into the Propontis and the Black Sea, you can see why that entrance there was such a valuable place in ancient geography. Or you can see, what it looks like to approach Egypt from the Mediterranean and enter into the Nile Delta and see the Nile River pouring into the Mediterranean Sea. To approach these places, these famous cities and centers of civilization from the ground level as the people saw them, opens up and explains why things happen when and where they do, without any artificial need for explanation or theories or anything else. You can just see the geography of the land and why civilization took place where it did. So I collected all these pictures, and I had transparencies that I'd show on the board for the kids. And then all of a sudden, Microsoft came out with satellite mapping and 3D mapping features online. So you could look at a location in a web browser, and you could actually cause the Earth to move so that you could look at it from a 3D perspective and then kind of explore everything on the computer using satellite images. And it was just for my desire to teach history and geography with that view of how the different locations worked and why civilizations and wars and events took place where they did, all of a sudden was opened up by this new satellite mapping technology that led me to develop a world geography course back in 2008 using that technology online. The problem, unfortunately, was that I built a whole world geography course using Microsoft's, I think it was called Terra Server or something like that. And then Google Maps became so successful that Microsoft pulled the plug on their 3D mapping service, and that whole course was sort of wasted because the technology changed. But since then, Google Earth and Google Earth Viewer, which is like a 3D viewer of the world, just creates incredible study opportunities for kids where they can just explore the whole world from their living room using Google Earth. And I really encourage parents to help the kids to do things like that, because this ability that our kids have to learn geography using these satellite mapping tools is, in past generations in the world, would have been considered miraculous. To think about what it took to map out an area of the earth in the 1800s, and to think of how difficult it was to obtain any geographical knowledge beyond mere discussions or descriptions of land. And to think that now kids have the ability to just sit on a computer and with their mouse just explore, Mesopotamia or the Egyptian, the Nile River Delta, or to find the origin of the Nile River, or to travel across the Mediterranean and go to the Tiber River and travel up the Tiber River and look at Rome. That study opportunity is just so incredible historically, and we have to have our kids take advantage of that and help them to study world geography using these tools because they're so great and powerful. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what I'd like to see is for kids who are elementary school, middle school age, get into chronology and geography. Studying chronology the way I've explained it in our World Chronology course. And as I develop a new World Geography course, now that my old one had to be discontinued, I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to lead the kids on sort of a journey through world geography and help to allow them to use these tools to explore things and see the geography of the world in a way that actually helps them for their studies of history and literature. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we want to teach our children history. We have to teach our children history. But the way that we do that is through chronology and geography. You know, we really can't rely on just telling our kids what happened in history. First of all, historical events are infinite in number. There's no way that you can possibly cover everything. And then kids are just going to run into events. Let's say when they're reading a book, they're going to run into an event that they didn't learn about. And they have to be able to know how to think about and look into historical events when they need to, for things they discover and encounter in their own studies. And to do that, we have to provide them with these two tools, a knowledge of world chronology and a knowledge of world geography. These two studies are like the two books of world history that our kids really need to learn to become able to use history for their benefit in their studies and in their adult lives. I can tell you that I use chronology in my personal life all the time. For example, when I'm thinking about schooling and I'm writing articles about education, sometimes I just think about the fact that the idea of public schooling was invented in the 1850s. That means no one in 6,000 years of human history ever experienced or proposed any idea of public education. And today, just 150 years later, people cannot comprehend education outside of the public school model. And yet that model had never existed in history. It's things like that. So when I'm teaching about classical education, what will happen is I'll present an idea or a curriculum idea from history, and parents will actually refer to the public school way as traditional. And to grasp how someone can think that something that's only 100 years old is traditional, and the system of education that existed through the entire history of the world before that is this kind of radical, unproven idea, is just, it reveals how problematic it is to try to address issues with no sense of chronology. And that's the practical use that our kids really need, that they can gain through the study of chronology. So in the CLAA, you'll see world chronology and world geography. These are intended to be foundation courses for younger students to prepare them for upper level history studies. And then when they get to the high school years and they need history courses, we have all of them available. Like I said, world history, European history, US history, US government, all those courses will be available to them. Now, one last comment on those high school history courses. What I hate about modern history courses is that they're almost always politicized. And you've got, let's say, a Christian school that's using a history class to promote Republican politics to students, or you've got some liberal private school that uses its history classes to promote, this sort of socialistic liberal worldview through its history classes. That politicizing of history is a real evil that we have to avoid. But I don't think it's possible to avoid it because interpretation is necessary when you're teaching history. We're going to interpret history. For my sake, I'm going to interpret it from a Catholic perspective. And my kids, should understand it from a Catholic perspective. But we have to not allow the study of history to become so controlled by those political issues that we actually leave out many important events and topics because they just don't have an immediate political relevance, that we're interested in. So there's a need for a chronology-based history program. And when we get into high school history studies, I've chosen textbooks that I believe really present a full and helpful vision of the history of the period studied in that course, free from the political influences of modern schools and politics. And I've had to go back in history to find textbooks that can do that. And the other thing I want to say is most of the history courses that I offer, especially American history, will cut off at a point in the past. Let's say at the time of the Second World War. And there's a reason for that. Once you get into the world wars, especially the Second World War, you're dealing with video cameras. And we have historical footage of these events. We have historical footage of the Vietnam War, of the Gulf War fought in the 1990s. There's so much now, ever since the 1930s and 40s, that is available on video with live footage from the events, that I really believe that once you get into the study of modern history in the video era, it's better to look to places like the History Channel for specials that they have, for all of their topical series, because they actually have all historical footage of these events. Pearl Harbor, all these things. They go on. I watched a video recently of the discovery of the Midwest and the West by Lewis and Clark, and to have a History Channel program present that, where they actually go right down onto the trail and walk you through the whole experience, and the whole thing is presented in dramatized form in the actual look. There's just no way to compete with that, studying history in a textbook. So what you'll find is that most of my history courses will cut off at a certain point, and the reason why is because I think that there's other ways that you should pursue studying periods after that cutoff date that the textbook really doesn't serve as well as those other opportunities would. And if you'd like help identifying those programs and you'd like recommendations for things to have the kids watch, you can use evening television time as a productive way to cover a lot of really great history by watching History Channel videos and things like that. And I strongly recommend that, because you just can't compete in textbooks with the ability for kids to watch and see in real historical footage those people and places and events like they can see in modern times on video-based history programs. So that's it for this introduction to history studies in the classical liberal arts. I hope you understand now why we put so much focus on chronology and geography. I hope you make use of these courses, and I really believe that we can have kids with extraordinary historical knowledge coming out of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy in years from now. So if you have any questions about these studies or any issues about the content of classes or perspectives on certain issues that you might be concerned as a parent about having your children study, please ask me those questions. I'm happy to discuss all the nitty-gritty details of any course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, because there's a reason why everything is the way it is, and I'm happy to talk about those things because I'm actually proud of them, and I'm excited to share them with parents and teachers and see our kids benefit from the things that we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So I hope that's a helpful introduction. We're going to fly through these subjects in this survey course intended for teachers and parents, so this is just an introduction. Now we're going to get to work and actually see how this all works out. I hope that's helpful. God bless.